Avowed surprised me. This beautiful, open-ended role-playing game is gorgeous. It runs smoothly on PC and consoles alike, and it leverages Unreal Engine 5's latest features almost without fault. But anyone familiar with Obsidian Entertainment's storied history would also know that its track record for technical polish isn't exactly sterling, which is precisely why I was so surprised and impressed with Avowed. Against the odds, it's one of the better uses of Unreal Engine 5 I've experienced to date, utilizing the engine's promised features with minimal visual issues and solid performance. So today I want to share my thoughts with you on the visuals, demonstrate its strengths, discuss its weaknesses, while comparing the two Xbox versions and sharing impressions of the PC version. Alex Battaglia also joins us in this video to discuss his findings on lower spec PCs. What kind of experience can you expect? Let's find out. At its core, Avowed follows a model not unlike The Outer Worlds, one of Obsidian's previous games. What I mean is that it's an open world game, but with a smaller, more focused scope rather than a single giant sprawling map. This, I feel, works in its favor, as the Living Lands offers beautiful, interesting places to explore, broken up into moderately sized chunks, but each of these areas has a lot to see and do within. So pre-release, I can't say that any of the trailers grabbed my attention, at least visually, but playing the game for myself, I was genuinely surprised by its beauty and atmosphere. I would almost describe the game's aesthetic as an unusual cross between the Elder Scrolls series and Chrono Cross. Seriously. The game is bathed in bold colors, unusual shapes, and towering structures. When you enter a dungeon, you're often treated to visuals that you may never have expected to find in a typical dungeon. It's honestly really impressive. As I noted earlier, of course, Obsidian's first-person RPGs have also exhibited a lot of bugs and general lack of polish. While Avowed is not perfect, and you may still bump into rough patches from time to time, it's surprisingly well tuned, managing to avoid most of the pitfalls we saw in their prior works. Certainly, things like animation, camera movement, NPC behavior, battles, not to mention technical performance, all feel so much more polished. As an Unreal Engine 5 title then, it should come as no surprise that Avowed uses both Lumen and Nanite, as well as virtual shadow maps, but it's how they're used that really helps demonstrate their worth in this case. Take Nanite, for instance, this virtualized geometry system that we've discussed many times on Digital Foundry is designed to offer a seamless, continuous LOD that massively reduces the perception of pop-in, or at least that's the goal, right? This is a perfect solution for open world games, where you often see objects either pop in or exhibit visual changes based on proximity. Drawing everything at full detail way off into the distance just isn't realistic, so Nanite seeks to basically solve this by continuously adjusting the detail level on objects as you approach. So with Avowed, they've managed to leverage Nanite for virtually everything. Take these trees, for instance. This is usually a sticking point for these open world games. They're detailed and modeled out with a good amount of geometry on display, but let's step back across the map here. Focus your eyes on this tree in the distance. Now, as I begin to walk forward towards the tree, keep your eyes focused on that tree. Note how it never really changes or jumps in terms of perceptible visual quality. The tree feels consistent right up until you reach your destination. That is Nanite in action. The same is true of buildings and the landscape itself for that matter, all of which feel extremely consistent regardless of your position on the map. This means while exploring the Living Lands, everything just feels solid. More so than usual for games like this, especially those from Obsidian. It's a great showcase for virtualized geometry rendering as you gain both near and far field detail. But there is one caveat. Some objects, such as clumps of grass, can still be observed popping in from time to time. Now, this varies according to the PC settings or between the different performance modes on Xbox, but basically, once an object does pop into the world, you should then no longer perceive any additional LOD changes while moving towards it. so it's just pop-in of small objects that you might pick up, but everything else is very stable. This is in sharp contrast to something like The Outer Worlds, which was powered by Unreal Engine 4. That game has near constant LOD swaps using the more traditional methods, so Avowed's use of Nanite is a huge improvement over what came before it. There is one other distance-based artifact as well though. Specifically, you may have noticed something going on with the shadows. Essentially, Avowed seems to make use of a combination of virtual shadow maps and screen space shadows for fine detail. VSMs are nice in that you can eliminate the flaws of cascaded shadow maps, but at the same time, they're very expensive and memory intensive. To combat this, Obsidian has essentially excluded smaller details like foliage from the VSM, instead relying on screen space shadows to fill in those missing details. So this hybrid approach obviously has some flaws that you'll spot while exploring the world, especially along the edges of the screen, but it still looks pretty good, and it is a lot more performant this way. The results are still better than traditional CSMs. Then we have Lumen. Now, Avowed uses both Lumen GI and Lumen Reflections, but the quality does vary per settings, which we'll get to shortly. At its best, Lumen provides an excellent solution for real-time global illumination. Avowed features a dynamic time of day, and Lumen allows this light to behave more naturally. Rich shadows and crevices are filled in properly. Color transfer is visible as light bounces across the scene, while Lumen Reflections allow specular surfaces to exhibit beautiful glossy reflections. When you combine these techniques with the stellar art direction, you get something that really feels impressive. More beautiful than expected even. Obsidian has been using Unreal Engine for a while now, but this is the first game they've made in 3D that manages to sidestep most of the rendering issues that we're used to seeing in open world RPGs. It's clear in this case that UE5 delivered actual value to the team, allowing them to build their most impressive world to date. But of course, it doesn't change the fact that Unreal Engine 5 is a demanding engine requiring some sacrifices. So what does that mean in terms of performance and visual settings? Well, let's start by looking at the Xbox version. When played on a Series X, users of 60Hz screens have access to a quality mode and a performance mode. When connected to a 120Hz screen, however, a third option opens up, balanced. This one targets 40 frames per second while maintaining near visual parity with the quality mode. Enabling VRR then unlocks yet another option, one to uncap the frame rate. This is all excellent stuff. We've been pushing for 40 FPS options in games for years now, but it has remained relatively uncommon on the Xbox side of things, so I'm relieved that Obsidian took the time to implement it here. These are exactly the types of future-looking options that we love to see in modern games. Now, if you're playing on Xbox Series S, you have access to two modes, quality and balanced. If you're using a 60Hz screen, quality becomes the only option. There is no 60 FPS performance mode here. But what do these settings actually do in terms of visual quality, you might be wondering? So let's start with the Series X version. The quality and balance mode both feature full software lumen, including reflections along with an increase in density of small objects around the world such as foliage. Quality mode has slightly more vegetation than balance mode, but they are reasonably comparable. When switching to performance mode, however, you lose these features. Lumen GI is still used, of course, but the results are somewhat noisier. Yet Lumen Reflections are completely disabled. You only get screen space results, which is why, when occluded, only the sky color can be observed in the reflection. This wouldn't be a huge deal on its own, but they also had to sacrifice a ton of scenery detail. I feel like this area really demonstrates what I mean. It's as if someone used a magic lawnmower on the surroundings here in performance mode. On top of that, the shadow quality also suffers, as the shadows appear somewhat grainy in performance mode. Speaking of grain, there was one area in a dungeon where I noticed the Series X version broke down even in quality mode. It seemed as if the game's denoiser basically stopped working properly, so the surroundings became extremely grainy upon close inspection. I only ever encountered it this one time, however, but it was interesting. So if performance mode is like this on Series X, what is the Series S version like? while the quality mode on that version is comparable to the balanced mode on Series X, though with reduced image quality, while balanced mode winds up falling somewhere between performance and balanced mode in the Series X version. The Series S balanced mode also loses lumen reflections like Series X performance mode. Resolution-wise, quality mode on Series X seems to run around 1440p most of the time with upsampling to 4K. Performance mode drops that down to around 1080p instead. Image quality is still reasonably acceptable, but it's certainly softer. Balance mode is trickier due to lack of capture hardware for 4K 120 output, but it seems to fall somewhere around what we see in quality mode, though perhaps a bit more variable. Series S in quality mode then seems to hold mostly around the 1080p mark, while balanced mode drops closer to 720p. The issue with balanced mode is that the resolution is just a little too low for this game, with noise and pixel artifacts becoming rather severe, so I don't really recommend it in this case. So now we have an idea of how the game looks on both consoles, but how does it actually run? Well, in my experience, the quality mode largely delivers on its 30 FPS promise, with only the tiniest of hiccups here and there. This holds true on both Series X and Series S, by the way. The 40 FPS balanced mode is also solid in both cases from what I found. That said, I've heard from another reviewer that they encountered a major performance drop during one specific area, but when visiting the same area, I was unable to reproduce this myself. So I think the takeaway here is that there is a chance for drops, but it's largely uncommon. That is, unless you're playing in the performance mode on Series X. This is a mode where I recommend using VRR if it's an option, as there are major areas which are simply unable to lock down to the target frame rate of 60. The first town, for instance, mostly falls below 60 FPS the entire time. There's also occasional stutters like this, as well as a small tearing line along the top of the screen when the frame rate dips below 60 FPS, though thankfully it really is just those top few pixels, so not really noticeable. Even still, this is Obsidian's best performing console game by far. It's certainly not perfect by any means, but it's pretty good. My recommendation is, if you have the option, stick with the balance mode on Series X and quality mode on Series S. But what about the personal computer? My first impressions were largely positive. There were some minor stutters evident, but I felt as if the experience was largely smoother than other recent Unreal Engine 5 titles. But more on that in a moment. The key here though is that Avowed supports additional features when compared to the Xbox version, while also potentially offering better performance. The largest enhancement can be found with the inclusion of hardware lumen support for reflections and global illumination. This can be enabled or disabled by checking this box, though, as is the case with changing modes on Xbox, it is the one setting that requires you to restart the game. So, what does this actually do for you visually then? Well, let's start by looking at lumen reflections. When enabled, reflections look significantly better than in the default software mode, unlike Ninja Gaiden 2 Black, which I covered recently, where it was broken. To understand this better though, let me switch to a visualizer here. So, with hardware ray tracing disabled, the game falls back to software lumen reflections, just like we see on Xbox. And as we've discussed before with software lumen, the rays are actually being traced into a signed distance field representation of the environment. So there is still ray tracing happening, but it's not tracing against geometry. That's where hardware lumen comes in, where it does actually trace into a geometric representation of the scene. The SDF variant of the scene just tends to be a lot less detailed. It's pretty clear that enabling hardware mode then massively boosts the details of reflections as a result, and it looks really great across the board. Whether it's water or other shiny surfaces, it does make a big difference. But this also applies to global illumination. This scene, for instance, appears more detailed with increasingly granular lighting along with less light leakage when hardware lumen is enabled. The same can be seen here as well. Notice how on the hardware side, there's not only more objects in the scene, but there's more light actually filling the space. The area above the door frames, for instance, is completely black on the software side. This gets filled in with a screen space solution instead. so hardware mode basically allows far more accurate lighting calculations. But of course, this is more expensive, requiring a more powerful PC, but visually at least I think the results speak for themselves. In fact, all of the cinematic shots in this video were created with hardware Lumen enabled. I think it looks absolutely excellent. The PC version also includes support for multiple upsampling options, including DLSS, FSR3, and TSR, along with the native resolution mode. You have things like sliders for FOV and motion blur as you'd expect, along with a slew of other settings. Of course, I played all this on an RTX 5090 equipped PC, and while I did encounter a few hiccups here and there, the experience was, as you would hope, excellent. But I also wanted to better understand how it would run on a lower spec machine, so I called our resident PC expert Alex in to share his thoughts. Take it away, Alex.
Thanks, John, for the handoff. With Avowed on PC, I can easily say this game does things better than the vast majority of Unreal Engine 5 titles on a technical level, but it still has standard issues that we have come to expect from Unreal Engine games that will become more obvious the lower end your GPU and CPU are. Starting off with one of the better things the game does is shader pre-compilation. There is a shader pre-compilation step in this game that is somewhat brief, taking only around 4 minutes on a Ryzen 5 3600. For the most part, this seems to capture a large amount of the possible shaders that the game could potentially use. But significantly, it does not precompile all of them that you will encounter in your adventure. This is especially true when you get to the open world area of the game, where there, even on an ultra high-end CPU like the 9800 X3D, you can see frame time stutters between 100 or 200 milliseconds at worst for some of the more complex shaders when encountering new creatures or areas for the first time. In fairness, this happens much less than I've seen in many other Unreal Engine 5 titles, but it was visible to see, and it was noticeable in the first time of play in the open world area when attempting to lock frame rates down even with a frame rate cap. On a lower end CPU like the Ryzen 5 3600, these frame time spikes from shader compilation can be more than 2 times in size and are even more noticeable as a result. Here in the future, I would like to see the devs implement shader pre-compilation for all potential shaders if possible, so that your play experience in the open world is smooth the first time you do it. Sticking with shader pre-compilation briefly, I want to mention that I surprisingly encountered freezing during shader compilation on both of my test PCs occasionally. It surprised me the most, especially on the Ryzen 5 3600, where there I've never ever had any stability issues. Perhaps my machines are unstable in a way that only this game exposes, or perhaps this is a bug with the game. The developers have sent us patch notes for the game's first patch, which is not available as of this video's production, and it does call out this issue, so perhaps it'll be fixed. Either way, if you are running a Ryzen PC with NVIDIA drivers and come across the game freezing while compiling or verifying shaders, then know you are not alone. Getting into the game itself, one thing I'm happy to report is that VRAM does not seem to be an issue at reasonable resolutions like we see in many Unreal Engine 5 games. Here, even while using an 8GB 4060 while leveraging hardware ray tracing, I was still not having VRAM issues. Hardware RT is great here, as John will have covered, and is eminently usable. So the game is fine in regards to VRAM, but image quality in the game could be questionable at times on a lower end GPU like this one. As I see it, many core graphical effects scale poorly to the low resolutions that many mid-range players will probably use. Take for example shadow quality in the game. On the RTX 4060, it defaulted to medium. Yet at 1080p DLSS quality mode using that CNN 3.5 model that the game ships with, the shadows at rest are extremely grainy, constantly moving, and honestly look rather ugly. Only when the shadows were bumped up to epic did the noise get under control. The same proves true for the reflection and global illumination settings. At the aforementioned resolution, they looked rather poor until bumped up to high or epic. So if you're going to play this game on a mid to low range GPU, you're going to be probably using upscaling, in which case you will probably want to bump up shadows, global illumination, and reflections up to the epic setting to reduce the amount of noise in them. The standard denoising for all these effects is just not high quality enough at this resolution here. Another thing that helps with noise and image quality in general would be injecting the transformer model of DLSS, which will clean up fizzle from GI, shadows, reflections, and more. So that is another thing you can do to help out image quality here. Like any and every Unreal Engine game that tries to do worlds larger than a small hallway, I unfortunately have to report that Avowed stutters when traversing the open world. The size of these stutters, though, is heavily dependent on the CPU that is running the game. Even while I bumped everything down to the lowest settings possible, just moving across the world on the Ryzen 5 3600 sees frame time spikes up to 33 milliseconds every few meters, and those denser areas will always see frame time spikes between 50 and 150 milliseconds, or potentially even more. The average frame time variance when moving around is just distractingly poor. So, a CPU like the Ryzen 5 3600 really has no hope of holding onto a steady 60 FPS in this game, even while on the lowest settings possible. If you tried to implement a 60 FPS cap like we see here, you will still be seeing constant and consistent, distractingly bad frame times, as the CPU is just far too overburdened here. On a CPU like this, you are best served by implementing a 30 FPS cap, which will flatten most of the experience out, making it consistent. But still, even then, you will manage to see something that looks like thread stalling occurring before you get up to the more built-up areas of the game. Big frame time spikes that are pretty obvious even with the 30 FPS cap in place. So the low-end CPU experience in this game, like with the Ryzen 5 3600, is pretty poor and requires many compromises while still being troubled. Thankfully, though, the game scales incredibly well in the upward direction on CPUs. The Ryzen 7 9800X3D offers a 280% higher average frame rate than the Ryzen 5 3600 in my measurements. If you have a higher end CPU with 3D cache, you'll be having a worlds different experience than what I just showed on the 3600. It is tangibly better for the visual smoothness in the game, yet you will still see it affected by traversal stutters, just to a smaller degree. When the frame rate is fully unlocked and the game ends up being CPU limited, frame time spikes are visible on the frame time graph there, ending up a little bit below 16 milliseconds, or at the worst, a bit below 33 milliseconds. So if you had VRR display and you were playing with an unlocked frame rate, you might see frame time hitching due to these irregularities on the frame time graph when walking around the world. This is not including potential shader compilation stutters that would occur. Therefore, I recommend those of you with a high-end CPU to cap the frame rate pre-frame generation to 60 FPS to smooth out the experience and also give the CPU headroom in between frames to work on future frames with less trouble. When running around the world utilizing a 60 FPS VSync cap on that 9800X3D, I saw a perfect frame time graph for the 20-minute benchmark journey that I set out on. So you can achieve a smooth experience in this game with high-end kit. It's just that you'll have to settle for a frame rate cap, and you'll have to take any shader compilation stutters that you see in stride. Coming to the end of my mini segment on Avowed on PC, I'm seeing a game that runs better than a lot of Unreal Engine titles in some ways, but at the same time, it still evidences issues that are common to nearly all Unreal Engine titles. For some reason, too, the Ryzen 5 3600 is especially poor in this title in a way that surprised me a little bit. So perhaps that can be worked on for future patches so that we don't see that stalling occurring on the CPU when approaching the game's larger settlements. Similarly, it would be good to see them make the shader pre-compilation more complete so that the first time you traverse the world is as smooth as possible. But anyway, enough from me for now, and back to you, John.
Thanks, Alex. That was excellent. It certainly seems that Avowed, while performant, is ultimately rather heavy, and lower-end kit may struggle. This also explains why it was seemingly impossible to reach 60 FPS with a full set of visual features on Xbox Series X, and why things like shadows and volumetric clouds can often appear rather grainy on console. It's performant for what it is, but that doesn't mean it's not still very heavy. While we're on the topic of flaws, though, I did want to briefly talk about the character rendering, arguably the game's weakest point. The main cast and major characters are all well modeled with plenty of detail, but the animation is somewhat limited, and there's very few dramatic moments. It's thankfully enough to communicate the game's excellent writing, but it can appear somewhat stilted in motion. It is funny that your first companion looks like he stepped out of Concord, but hey, at least his actual character is pretty great. For Mass Effect fans, he's basically a Garrus type. And these characterizations have always been a strength of Obsidian and remain a strength here. Despite the mid-tier character rendering, the actual writing and storytelling is very engaging with a large range of choices available to the player. On another note, I wanted to briefly mention the HDR implementation. While the game does support HDR and looks pretty good, I was disappointed that there's no options for adjusting the HDR presentation in-game, just a single gamma slider for both PC and Xbox. It seems to derive settings from the system level, but additional customization would have been appreciated. Lastly, while my experience was largely bug-free, I did encounter a couple crashes on Xbox Series X. In both cases, it was while loading a save game. It simply dropped out of the game back to the dashboard with no error message or explanation. This, in addition to the shader comp crashes that Alex faced, suggests that it's not buttoned up completely tight here. Ultimately, though, Avowed mostly impressed me. I really didn't expect much going into the game, but walked away having had a great time. It's beautiful, it plays surprisingly well, features great characters and storytelling, and frankly, has all the markings of a future cult classic. Obsidian did a fantastic job with this one, and it sits comfortably with their previous games in terms of quality. Of course, it is not perfect. It's still very demanding, there's visual issues at lower settings, and some bugs are certainly possible, but it still feels like a step in the right direction for Obsidian when it comes to technical performance. I also appreciate how this follows the more hub-like design of something like the Outer Worlds, where it's not just one giant map, but a series of different areas, each which feel reasonably large without being overwhelming. So yeah, give it a shot if you're interested. I think it may surprise you. But that's going to do it for this video, so I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you soon.